Picture a Roman prison in winter. Not the kind artists have painted. Golden torchlight, heroic figures, shadows arranged for maximum drama. The actual kind. Stone walls that hold cold the way a grave holds silence. A single oil lamp fighting the dark and losing most of the battle. The smell of iron and damp stone. A man sits in a cold prison cell. His hands have a history. They have been beaten with rods. They have worked at tent making in city after city to earn his own bread, because he refused to be a burden. They have been in chains. Right now they are holding parchment and a stylus, and they have not stopped working even here. He is writing what may be his last letter, not composing theology for posterity, not managing how he will be remembered. Writing to a young man he loves like a son. And in the middle of that letter, almost without announcement, he writes a name. Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. 11 words. That is all Demas gets. Somewhere in Thessalonica, a man who once worked alongside Paul is living an ordinary life, a predictable one, a life with no chains, no cold, no lamp burning down to nothing. A life that has never once demanded what this cell demands. Those 11 words have never stopped asking their question. And for the next 30 minutes, we are going to sit inside them. There is a letter Paul wrote to a man named Philemon. It is barely a page long. Paul is in prison, writing about a runaway slave named Onesimus, who had come to faith and was being sent back to his master with Paul's personal endorsement. Near the end of the letter, Paul sends greetings from those who are with him. He names them Epaphras, Mark, Aristarchus, Luke, and then Demas, one name among trusted men. No explanation attached, no introduction required, just Demas, listed without hesitation alongside people Paul would name again and again across years of letters. Notice what Paul calls them, my fellow workers. That phrase carried weight in Paul's vocabulary. Fellow worker was not a courtesy title for someone who had been helpful once or donated money from a comfortable distance. It described men who were actually in it, present in the cities where the work was difficult, absorbing the same exposure, carrying the same costs with their actual time and bodies. To be called a fellow worker by Paul was to be counted as someone who had made a sustained and costly commitment, not in theory, but in practice. Demas was counted among them. Then comes the letter to the Colossians, another greeting near the end from those who are with Paul. Luke the physician is mentioned, and right beside him, once more, Demas. 2 different letters, 2 different churches. Both times, the same name, in the same company. The gap between who Demas was in those first 2 letters and who he becomes in the third one is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is quiet. And that is exactly what makes it so difficult to stop thinking about. Following Paul was not a faith practice you added to the margins of an otherwise stable life. It was total exposure, a continuous, unpredictable immersion in everything that a calling like Paul's attracted, which was not comfort. Paul describes his own life in his second letter to the Corinthians with a plainness that is striking. Beaten with rods on 3 separate occasions, stoned in the city of Lystra, dragged outside the gates, left for dead on the road. Shipwrecked 3 times, not as a metaphor, but actually thrown into open water and pulled back out of it. He lists dangers from rivers, from bandits, from his own people, from Gentiles, in cities, in wilderness, at sea, from men who called themselves brothers and were not. He describes his existence as a kind of daily dying. Demas had not read this from a distance. He was there. He was in those cities when the climate changed and leaving quickly became necessary. He was on those roads when the way ahead was uncertain. He watched close up what it looked like when Paul was brought low by things that would have ended most people, and what it looked like when Paul stood back up. Here is what that closeness would have shown him if his eyes were open to it. Paul's endurance was not rooted in Paul. Paul was extraordinarily clear about his own weakness. He did not hide it. He wrote in that same letter to the Corinthians that when he was weak, he was strong, because the power at work in him was Christ's, not his own. He was a vessel carrying something that did not originate in him. And that was precisely why the vessel kept functioning even when everything about its condition said it should not. Demas had been near enough to see this from the inside. He had been close to a man who treated eternity as his actual reference point, not as a doctrine he believed, but as the real lens through which every hardship and every city and every chain was understood. Faith was not a compartment of Paul's life. It was the architecture the whole life was built on. He had been close enough to watch a man come out of a beating and go straight to prayer. Close enough to see Paul stand before crowds that wanted him silenced and speak without flinching. Close enough to recognize that none of it was manufactured from inside Paul himself. Paul made no secret of the source. It was the life of Christ working through a man who had stopped insisting on his own preservation. Not Paul's courage producing the endurance. Something that did not originate in Paul, and therefore was not limited by Paul's limits. Demas had watched all of that at close range. And still, in the slow accumulation of days and roads and uncertain seasons, something in him began to move in a different direction. The cities Paul and his companions moved through were not abstract mission destinations. They were real places filled with real people living real lives. Actual streets where men argued prices in the early morning and women carried bread home before the heat came. Families with roots and routines and neighbors they had known their whole lives. Businesses that had taken a generation to build. Children growing up in the same city where their grandparents had grown up. People who went to sleep at night without calculating what tomorrow might cost them. Demas walked through those streets. He saw those lives from the outside, day after city after road. And over time, the outside view began to change in him. Not suddenly. The way light changes in a room at the end of the day, so gradually that you do not notice the room is darker until it already is. The Bible does not record the specific moment when something in Demas shifted. But the condition Paul names, that Demas loved this present world, does not describe a state that arrives fully formed. It describes a direction the heart moves in over time, fed by attention and accumulated choice, until it becomes the dominant orientation of everything a person does. The pull of ordinary life does not usually arrive as an obvious temptation. It tends to wear more reasonable clothing than that. It arrives as exhaustion, as the recognition that a certain pace is genuinely not sustainable indefinitely, as the slowly growing sense that what is being asked is disproportionate to what any human being was built to carry. None of those feelings are spiritually wrong in themselves. Tiredness is real. Human limits are real. There is nothing sinful about noticing them. But what a person does with those feelings determines where the next season of their life gets built. Brought honestly before God, they become the raw material of genuine conversation, and sometimes of genuine deepening. Used instead to quietly build a case for a smaller, safer, less demanding life, they become the first bricks of something else entirely. The drift does not announce its own beginning. It does not feel like departure when it starts. It feels very often like relief. And sometimes it presents itself as something more deceptive than that, as spiritual maturity. As the honest acknowledgement that early faith often carries an intensity that cannot burn at the same heat forever, and that accepting this is simply the adult thing to do. There is just enough truth in that observation to make it dangerous. Seasons of faith do change. Growth does not always look the same across every period of a life. But there is a significant difference between a faith that matures and deepens through seasons of change and a faith that simply shrinks. Between wisdom about how to spend energy and a life gradually restructured around avoiding whatever costs the most. That difference is not always easy to see from the inside, which is precisely why the drift so often travels a long distance before it is caught. 3 words sit at the center of Paul's sentence about Demas: loved this present world. It would be easy to read those words as describing some dramatic moral collapse, some obvious failure that finally broke through whatever had been holding him. But that is not the category Paul uses. He does not name a sin. He names a love that had moved to the wrong object and settled there. The Greek word translated as world in this sentence is aion. Not the physical earth, not the beauty of creation, not ordinary human life considered as itself. Scripture does not condemn a person for being human or for finding ordinary things good. Aion carries a different weight, this present age, this current order of things, a system of value, a particular way of answering the questions that quietly govern everything a person does. What is worth pursuing? What is worth protecting? And what you are ultimately willing to pay for what you want. When that system becomes the organizing center of a life, when what can be seen and guaranteed has risen above what can only be trusted, when safety has risen above faithfulness, when the preservation of a predictable future has become the thing every other decision quietly exists to protect. That is what John describes in his first letter. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. That passage is not claiming the world is built of evil material. It is describing a condition of the heart. The heart has one center. Whatever holds that center governs everything else. What a person notices, what they protect, what they grieve when it is threatened, what they silently reorganize their life around keeping. 2 ultimate loves cannot occupy that center at the same time. One will, over time, displace the other, not in a single confrontation, in the quiet, accumulated pressure of daily choosing. For Demas, that pressure had been working long enough and in a consistent enough direction that by the time Paul names what happened, the center had already moved. The small decisions had already added up to the architecture of a life pointed somewhere else. The writer of Hebrews names this kind of movement with a single word: drifting. Not sailing toward destruction with a plan, not pursuing ruin as a goal, just drifting. Losing ground to a current so gradually that you do not feel the movement until you look up one day and you are somewhere you never chose to be. And you cannot point to the exact moment the current took you. Demas did not wake up one morning and decide to leave Paul alone in a Roman prison and walk away from everything he had committed to. The picture the text paints is quieter and more unsettling than a single decision. He likely woke on many mornings and made smaller choices, each one reasonable in isolation, each one a believable response to something real, that gradually accumulated into the one large choice Paul names. This is the part of the story that will not stay in the first century. Think about someone who, not long ago, came to their Bible in the morning, not as a discipline to perform, but out of actual hunger, genuinely wanting what was there, not going through motions, interested, and who now, in a quiet and honest moment, realizes that months have passed since they opened it, not because of a crisis, not because they decided to stop, because other things kept filling that time, and faith kept getting moved to later, and later kept arriving full of something else. Or think about someone who used to show up for people, who used to be genuinely present, serving, giving time and energy in ways that actually cost something. And who now, without a formal announcement, without a visible decision, has quietly stopped. Not because they renounced anything, just because separate reasons accumulated, each reasonable on its own, until the reasons became routine, and the routine became a settled absence that no one has named yet, or someone who used to structure real parts of their life around what they believed. Actual decisions about money, about time, about what they were willing to sacrifice when something larger required it, someone whose faith used to have practical weight in the week. And who now, without noticing exactly when it happened, has reorganized everything so that God receives what remains after every other priority is already served. Present in name, but no longer governing anything. That is what the drift looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the slow movement of a heart that has been quietly choosing something else, morning after morning, until the direction it is facing is simply no longer the direction it started in. Paul says Demas went to Thessalonica. The Bible does not follow him there. It does not describe what he found when he arrived, whether the ordinary life looked the same up close as it had appeared from a distance. Some have suggested Thessalonica may have had personal meaning for Demas, that it may have been his home city, though the text does not confirm this. The Bible leaves those details closed. What it does not leave closed is the word Paul chose for the leaving itself. Deserted. The Greek is egkatalepo. It is not a clinical word dressed up to sound significant. It carries the weight of abandonment, of withdrawing support from someone who was counting on it, leaving them behind in a difficult place without making provision for what they would need once you were gone. The same root appears in the Septuagint when the psalmist cries out, asking whether God has forsaken him. Paul did not choose a gentle synonym. He named what happened with the word that fit it most accurately. Demas deserted him. And then Paul keeps writing. He names the loss plainly, without minimizing it and without performing indifference to it. The grief in those 11 words is real, not theatrical grief constructed for effect, but the quiet grief of someone whose absence costs you something you are still paying. But Paul does not allow that grief to become the direction of the letter. He asks Timothy to come before winter. He mentions the cloak left in Troas. He asks for his books and his parchments. He names those who are still faithful. He gives instructions. The work has not stopped. That is worth pausing on. A man sitting largely alone in a cold Roman cell, recently abandoned by someone he trusted, facing the real possibility that this is where his life ends. And his response is to ask for his books and get back to work. Not from a place of denial, from a place where the thing that had given him purpose in every other season was still giving him purpose in this one. Even in how Paul receives the departure of Demas, something is being demonstrated about what it looks like to remain anchored when the ground around you has shifted. Demas was not a monster imported into this story to play the villain. He was not someone who had infiltrated the faith under false pretenses. He was not a man performing commitment he had never actually felt. He was genuinely present, genuinely working, genuinely trusted enough to be named in correspondence, read aloud to churches in cities across the Roman world. He had been given proximity to costly, tested, first-hand faith. He had watched it endure things that nothing merely human endures without breaking. He had every spiritual advantage a person in his position could have had. And the drift took him anyway. not because he was uniquely fragile, not because something in his character was defective in a way that sets him apart from anyone reading or watching this today, but because the pull of the present age is persistent, and it does not respect spiritual history. It does not grant exemptions to people who have sat under good teaching or grown in committed communities or been close to genuinely devoted faith for years. It works on everyone, quietly, without announcing itself. The question Demas's story drops into a person's hands is not, how could someone in his position walk away? The question is, where is the love of my life currently pointed? Not the version of yourself you intend to become when circumstances are more favorable. Not the spiritual life you have told yourself you will return to once the current season passes. Right now, in the actual shape of your days, in what gets protected and what gets deferred, in what you return to when you are tired, and what quietly gets moved to later when you are full. What holds the center? That is not a question designed to produce shame. Shame is not a useful destination, and this story is not trying to take anyone there. But honest clarity, the kind that is brought before God without performing a closeness that does not yet exist, is the beginning of almost every genuine movement in a human life. And this story will not let a person sit comfortably without asking for it. There is one more thing about what Paul writes that should not be passed over. After all the years of roads and cities and beatings and imprisonments and shipwrecks, after everything the mission had asked of him and everyone who had been asked to carry it with him, Paul is sitting alone with a lamp, a stylus, and a list of requests that includes a coat he has been cold without for some time. Demas left. Others had been sent to various assignments across the Roman world. And Paul, who had stood before governors and a king, who had addressed the philosophers of Athens, who founded communities of faith in city after city across Asia Minor and Europe, was sitting in a Roman cell with one companion, asking a young man in another city to come quickly before winter. And somewhere in Thessalonica, Demas was living the life that did not cost him that. Here is what the Bible does not tell us, whether it was enough. Whether the ordinary life looked, once Demas was inside it, like what it had seemed from the road. Whether comfort, finally achieved, felt the way he had imagined it would. The text gives us none of that. It does not assign Demas a verdict. It does not call him an apostate, does not sentence him to a theological category. It simply records what Paul said, through the unguarded honesty of a letter written without an audience, and then moves on. The reader is trusted to feel the weight of what is there without being told how heavy it is. The page turns. Demas is not on the next one. Drift does not always end in return. The Bible does not offer comfort where it would not be honest to offer comfort. But neither does it close the door before anyone has walked through it. And what Paul does after Demas leaves is its own kind of answer to a question the drift is always asking. The question is, what remains when the cost is that high and the company is that thin? For Paul, the answer was, the same thing that was there at the beginning. The same purpose, the same source, the same work, picked up again in the same cold cell, by the same hands that had never found a circumstance worth stopping for. There is something quietly significant in that contrast. Demas chose the life that cost less, and the Bible goes silent about him, not as a punishment, just as an honest accounting of what that choice produced. There is nothing more to report. Paul chose to keep going in conditions that should have produced nothing, and the letters he wrote in those conditions became some of the most read documents in human history. Not because Paul was remarkable in himself. He would be the last to claim that. But because something that does not stop working in a cold cell tends to leave something behind that outlasts the cell. Demas went to Thessalonica, and the page went quiet. Paul asked for his books and kept writing. 2,000 years later, we are still reading what Paul wrote. So what does a person do with a story that ends without resolution? Not use it as a hammer. Not point it at people who are struggling or distant or further from where they intended to be than they can fully explain. The gospel has never been built on human consistency. It is built on something far more durable than that. But the story does ask something, and the asking deserves an honest answer. Because the Bible is not only the record of people who drifted and stayed gone, it is also the record of a son who took everything his father gave him, walked away with it, and spent it on a life that left him in a foreign country, far from home, feeding pigs. He came to himself in the middle of that wreckage. He turned around. He prepared a speech about no longer being worthy to be called a son. He was still a long way off when his father saw him coming. And the father did not wait for the speech. He ran. It is also the record of Peter, who had left his fishing nets, who had been on the mountain when the voice came from the cloud, who had made his declaration of loyalty the very night everything fell apart, and who, within hours, by a courtyard fire, under the pressure of a servant girl's question, denied 3 separate times that he even knew the man he had just promised to die with. He went out into the dark afterward and wept. Scripture does not soften that. And then later, after the resurrection, after the empty tomb, after days of confusion about what any of it meant, a group of disciples had gone back to the water, back to fishing, because they did not yet know what else to do. And Jesus came to the shore. Another fire, the smell of fish in the early morning. And he asked Peter a question, the same question 3 times. Do you love me? Not. Were you consistent? Not. Can you account for the courtyard? Not. Have you paid what you owe for what happened that night? Just, do you love me? That question is the hinge on which every return turns. It is not a formula. It is not a list of conditions to satisfy before God will look in a person's direction. It is an invitation to reorientation, a turning back, a willingness to bring whatever remains of love, however weakened, however distracted, however far from where it once was, and point it in the right direction again. God works with that. He has always worked with that. He works with the answer that begins with, I want to. I am not where I once was, but I am turning around. That answer, brought before him honestly and without pretense, is enough to start with. It was enough for a son who had wasted everything. It was enough for a disciple who denied in a courtyard. The father was running before the son arrived. Demas shows us what happens when a person lets the drift settle into a direction and stops turning back. Peter and the son who came home show us what happens when someone who has drifted far, broken, empty, without much to offer, decides to move toward home anyway. The distance between those 2 outcomes is not strength of character, or a particular personality type, or accumulated spiritual achievement. It is the willingness to answer one question honestly, from wherever a person actually stands. Here is what I want to leave with you. Paul is in a cell, cold, writing by lamplight, asking for his coat, still working. Demas is in Thessalonica, warm, settled, ordinary, safe. And Scripture closes the page on Demas there. If you recognize something of Demas in yourself today, if something in this story landed close enough to be uncomfortable, I am not asking you to arrive somewhere you have not yet arrived. I am asking you to be honest about what you felt, and to bring it, without performance, to the one question that is still open. Do you love me? Not your best version's answer, not the answer that sounds right from the outside, the actual answer, from the actual place you are standing right now. Because the father in the story did not wait for his son to clean himself up first. He ran toward the mess. That is what the return has always looked like. Not impressive, not fully resolved, just honest and moving in the right direction. That is always enough to begin. If this video reached something real in you today, tell me about it in the comments. Where did this story find you? What are you carrying as you walk away from it? Your words down there matter, to me, and often to someone else who reads them and realizes they are not alone. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. This channel explores the lives of the people we encounter in the pages of Scripture, sometimes in great stories, sometimes in a single sentence, yet whose lives carry more weight than their brief mention might suggest. There is more ahead, and if someone in your life is in a quiet season of drift right now, not dramatically gone, just gradually further than they once were, and perhaps not fully aware of how far, share this with them. Not as a judgment, not as a lecture, just as an open door. Because the story of Demas belongs to every age in which the pull of the present is louder than it should be, which means it belongs to this one. The only question left is what we do when we recognize it in ourselves. That recognition is always where the turning begins.